Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. In London, I'm Brendan Cole. The US President Barack Obama is facing increasing pressure over US surveillance operations as the fallout continues from the revelations of an ex-CIA technical worker. Edward Snowden told the Guardian newspaper that US agencies gathered millions of phone records and monitored internet data in a program known as PRISM. Under this program, the National Security Agency, the NSA, and the FBI had access to systems of the world's top internet companies such as Google, Facebook, and Skype. Edward Snowden justified the leak.
This is something that's not our place to decide. The public needs to decide whether these programs and policies are right or wrong.
It has raised concerns over British intelligence and the relationship between the UK's GCHQ and the NSA. But the Foreign Secretary, William Hague, told the House of Commons that British intelligence agencies operated within the law.
To intercept the content of any individual's communications in the UK requires a warrant signed personally by me, the Home Secretary, or another Secretary of State. This is no casual process. Every decision is based on extensive legal and policy advice.
Edward Snowden has gone into hiding in Hong Kong and has said he anticipates he will be targeted by US law enforcement. He's been dubbed by some as the most significant whistleblower in US history. He follows in the footsteps of Bradley Manning, the United States Army soldier who was arrested in May 2010 in Iraq on suspicion of having passed classified material to the website WikiLeaks. Craig Murray is the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan. He was dismissed from his post when he blew the whistle on human rights abuses in the Central Asian country and British complicity in torture.
I think he's done the world a great favour by letting people know the extent to which they are spied upon, the extent to which ordinary people can come under the range of the security services, and the extent to which what people believe are personal communications are not in fact safe.
Craig Murray said the case of Edward Snowden had echoes of that of Bradley Manning.
There were notable resonances of Bradley Manning in the things that Snowden said, in particular his view that the public ought to be able to decide whether these things were right or wrong. These things didn't ought to be done without the knowledge of the public. Carried strong echoes of Bradley Manning's defence statement, where he said that it was essential that some of the crimes that had occurred in the course of the war in Iraq should be public knowledge. And I think that's often the case with whistleblowers. The idea that things which governments do in secret ought to be subject to public debate.
Edward Snowden has checked out of the hotel that he was staying in Hong Kong. Craig Murray said a lot would be going through Edward Snowden's mind right now.
In the case of Snowden and Bradley Manning and perhaps myself, when you've worked for a period of years inside the institutions of government, you have a fairly good idea what's going to happen to you. You do realize that this is going to be fairly terrible in terms of the immediate consequences for yourself. I don't expect that this is a surprise to him. He's going through with something which he knew he was going to go through. He's probably still, nonetheless, quite scared, quite disoriented. What I found as a whistleblower myself is that the most immediate disillusioning thing is the number of friends that you lose, people who you thought were your friends, who suddenly shun you.
But what is the fate of such whistleblowers who in effect take on the might of the state? Are whistleblowers heroes who shine a light into secretive practices that need to be revealed in the public interest, or are they people who betray their state? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Jag Singh. He's a political and digital strategist. Also joining me in the studio is Naomi Colvin. She's the founder of the group UK Friends of Bradley Manning. On the line, we have from Washington, D.C., Major General John Altenberg. He's a former lawyer for the US Army. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining me on The Voice of Russia. The revelations this week with regard to Edward Snowden. Jag Singh, how surprising is this? Is this particularly revelatory in your view?
No, I don't think so. I think most people operate under the assumption that, anything they post online, whether it's a private message or whether it's, a Twitter message broadcast to the rest of the world, is somehow, going to end up on some server in Fort Meade. One of the things that, we will sort of, we'll explore and we'll learn more in the coming days is to what extent the tech companies have been working with these shadowy sort of government agencies like the NSA and what kind of access they've given. I mean, they've come up vehemently saying no, we haven't given them direct access, but all these statements have been very carefully worded. So that's, I think, one of the interesting points that we'll learn more about in the coming days.
We share a lot of information on places like Facebook, and we have details on Skype, and we buy things on Amazon and all that kind of stuff. Are we being a bit naive in thinking that information, which in previous generations prior to the internet, it took intelligence agencies hours and hours of sweating bullets to try and find, all of a sudden we're volunteering this information. We must expect some degree of scrutiny of that, don't we?
Well, sure. I think the difference is that we trust organizations like Google and Skype and Microsoft with this data, with the caveat that we know they can't put us in jail. When they then share that information without our knowledge with the government, who then has the ability to sort of dig deeper and look into our political beliefs, our political belongings, our tax registration statuses, that's when it starts becoming really, really scary as a citizen.
Naomi Colvin, you're with the UK Friends of Bradley Manning, but just on this particular case of Edward Snowden, do you think he's done us a favour?
I think he has, and I think the reason why he's done us a favour is reflected in that clip you played earlier. The decision to harvest the metadata of the phone data of everybody in the United States and online, a large proportion of the world's population, exactly, it's an enormous decision. It is not a decision that should be taken by bureaucrats solely. It's a decision that the public in general has a right to be involved in. And without information, you can't be part of that debate. And I would say, even though we might have suspected that electronic data in some ways was travelling further than most people would be comfortable with, there's an enormous difference between assuming that this is happening and seeing it in print. It is an analogous situation with some of Bradley Manning's releases. People in Tunisia knew their government was corrupt, but it's different to see that said in print by the diplomats of another government.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing, are whistleblowers heroes or villains? I'm joined in the studio by Naomi Colvin, spokesperson and founder for UK Friends of Bradley Manning, Jag Singh, a political and digital strategist. From Washington, D.C., Major General John Altenberg, a former lawyer for the US Army. John Altenberg, the US Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, he's called the leaks reprehensible. Do you agree with them?
Well, I don't know that I'd choose his words. I mean, they violated the law, and so I don't think we can judge actions like this until many years later as to whether we want to characterize someone as a hero or a traitor. And so, for me, I don't see much difference in saying that they're not entitled to make that decision, which is what Mr. Snowden said yesterday. And I'd say, well, then why is he entitled to make that decision? And the people that made those decisions, many of them that were a part of it, were elected by the people in the United States. There were senators and congressmen that were aware of what was going on. The president was elected. There's ways to hold those kind of people accountable, and so I don't see much difference in a 19-year-old soldier and a 29-year-old employee assuming to themselves the right to make that decision. So if they violate the law, then the government's probably going to take the action that would be appropriate.
Jag Singh, I suppose it goes to the heart of who owns information, and you can argue that this is an illustration of how agencies don't own information. It's owned by social networks, it's owned by companies that have data on your purchasing history and things like that. And this isn't exactly a debate that's been had yet.
No, and part of the problem is that most consumers aren't really aware of the facts. And when we talk about data, your purchasing history on Amazon and my sort of ability to communicate with friends in different parts of the world via Skype, that data by itself surely belongs to me. But the interesting bit comes when other organizations are able to analyze and detect patterns. And so, someone purchasing 3 specific books on Amazon and communicating with, one person on Skype and also maybe playing a specific type of video game could fit the profile of a terrorist, in which case that isn't actually data, that's just analysis. And that analysis is performed by another entity who then owns that specific analysis. So it's not clear-cut, it's not easy to understand. The person who wins really is the person who's able to tie up all these various loose ends of data, tie them up into a package and analyse them. And
Naomi Colvin, do you believe William Hague when he says that in Britain no laws have been circumvented?
That statement yesterday was extremely carefully worded. And I have seen people have suggested different rules apply for when British intelligence requests information from another agency than if it is offered by another agency. If something is offered by another agency, then the precautions you would have to take in terms of what warrants and approval don't apply. So I think that what William Hague said needs to be analysed quite carefully, and we need to have a proper debate about this. Again, I think it's worth remembering that without Snowden's disclosures, we wouldn't be having that debate. And this is a good example of why whistleblowers are important. The Verizon order, which Snowden revealed, the company who received that legal order was not legally allowed to discuss it. If decisions are carried on in secret, there is no way for the public to debate this. There is no way for the decisions to be questioned. Secret law deserves to be challenged.
John Altenberg, what do you make of that? This is a debate that needs to be had.
Questionable whether the debate needs to be had by the public, and only time will tell us that. I mean, the debate certainly was held within the government. I can only speak for the U.S. government, and I'm sure that if somebody says something along the lines of the British authority yesterday, they'd word it very carefully also. They'd say that nobody in the government has access to the content of communications unless they're using a warrant, and that's probably true here also. And it is very carefully worded because they have access to all kinds of other information, but not the content of the communications unless they get a warrant. There are great debates within the government, within all the various branches of government. I mean, these things are lawyered to death. And what the public disclosure may bring is other lawsuits, and maybe and perhaps ultimately there'll be cases that find that what the government's been doing do violate the Fourth Amendment. I mean, you can get lawyers on either side of that issue even today based on the Snowden information.
We're talking about the metadata there, who spoke to whom, email addresses and that kind of thing, and certainly the argument in the last few days was that it required a ministerial approval to actually read the emails.
The scary bit about all of this is the fact that someone like, I know Edward Snowden didn't work for the UK government, but he wasn't an intelligence analyst, he wasn't an operator, he wasn't a spook of any sort, and he certainly wasn't elected. He was one of the people who was supposed to be watching the watchers, and if he had access to these bits of information, what's to prevent someone else? The main sort of uproar, I think, in the UK that we're going to see in the next few days is primarily the fact that whilst we've got nothing to hide as citizens, and the government is saying that they're taking all necessary precautions to make sure that this data, or even the metadata, which in my opinion is as valuable as the data itself, isn't going to fall in the wrong hands. We've been proven time and time again, Private Manning, Ed Snowden, that these things do happen, and so I think some of the best arguments I've heard is to say that, well, we shouldn't be collecting this data in the first place.
With reference to Bradley Manning, Naomi Colvin, you're the founder of the UK Friends of Bradley Manning. Do you see any kind of similarities between the case of Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden?
I see enormous similarities, and if you look at the way both have discussed their motivations, they do so in extremely similar terms in terms of wanting to create a worldwide debate and provoke reforms. They're also of the same generation. I think that's probably worth mentioning. I think that there are these large bureaucracies which operate to a large degree on secrecy. In order to function, they require the expertise of young people who have grown up, I think increasingly growing up, with different assumptions about what kind of information should be secret and what the public should know about. So Ed Snowden, to me, NSA contractor with the Electronic Freedom Foundation and Tor stickers on his laptop, it's emblematic of a generational shift.
And somebody who was a generation older, perhaps in their 50s, wouldn't have perhaps been that idealistic.
I think that growing up with the internet and that easy communication across boundaries and the possibilities that presents and the possibilities that people grow up with and accept as a matter of course, it changes your perspective. And I think we are seeing a generational shift happening here.
Jag Singh, I mean, what's your response? I mean, he's seen by many as a whistleblower whose actions revealed covert actions of the US government. Some are calling for him to get the Nobel Peace Prize. What do you think?
Well, I respectfully and completely disagree with Naomi. Sure, there are some correlations and some sort of, there's a degree of correlation between Manning and Snowden, but Ed Snowden was a civilian contractor for an arm of the United States government. Private Manning took an oath to sort of, defend the Constitution of the United States when he voluntarily joined the army, and he broke the rules and regulations of the Uniform Code of Conduct when he released information that was discovered in Osama bin Laden's compound when we raided it in 2011. Sure, I wouldn't argue against the sort of, the veracity of their intentions and the fact that, they may have had good intentions, but I think that those are two completely different cases. One clearly broke the law. that he sort of himself signed up to, and the other one, Ed Snowden, as a civilian, I think he did have the right to say, well, I don't agree with some of this information. And he himself has said that, in an attempt to sort of juxtapose himself with Manning, I suppose, has said that he's a lot more careful and he doesn't want to be as reckless.
John Altenberg, I mean, what do you think? What do you see the differences and similarities between the case of Snowden and Manning?
I agree with Jag that there is quite a difference, and I agree with the way he broke it out. That the one had a higher obligation. More significantly, I think that Snowden was very careful in what he released, and it ties more closely to his stated intention as to what motivated him. Manning's actions were just more reckless. Without too much thought as to what the possible results would be. It wasn't as specific and as focused, I think, as Snowden, and so I agree with Jag in that regard.
Naomi Colvin, his actions were reckless, Bradley Manning's, and also what they've done is they've endangered diplomacy around the world. Diplomats, part of their business is to be able to do their business without it being on the record. Otherwise, the business of diplomacy is rendered worthless.
No one has ever been able to document a case of physical harm coming to anyone as a result of Bradley Manning's disclosures. There's a reason why the prosecution has fought very hard to have any discussion of harm excluded from the terms of his court-martial. I think it's important to point out that nobody has ever managed to point to a single instance of physical harm that happened as a result of Bradley's releases. And actually, if you look in terms of the political impact, the impact is, on the plus and minus side, it's hugely on the positive side. Aside from that, I can see there is an attempt to draw a distinction between Snowden and Manning, and I think possibly that statement of Snowden made in response to some of the criticisms that have been made of Manning creates, is not wholly helpful in terms of understanding what Manning did. If you want to understand what Manning did, you should look at what he actually said to the court in a statement he made at the end of February, which was basically the only way he could get his point
that is
point
true.
of view forward.
But John Altenberg made the point that there is a distinction between what Ed Snowden did, which was carefully and controlled release of information, and what Bradley Manning did, which was wholesale release of information.
That's a misconception. If you look at what Bradley actually released, Bradley had top secret clearance. Everything he released, I think there are some secret documents in there, but a large proportion of it was actually unclassified. If you look at the particular items he released, they were either things he had great familiarity with because he was working with them day to day, like the reports of what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, or they were single pieces of information which he had read thoroughly and had, a thorough knowledge of.
All 700,000 pieces of information?
Or in the case of the State Department cables, if you read what he said, he had, a judgment on his part about whether any harm was likely to be caused was part of his thinking. And it's the characterization of what he did as wholesale leaking or dumping. If you don't take account of that, it's just inaccurate.
Okay, Jag Singh, what's your reaction to that? No harm done.
I stand by that. Well, okay, so Naomi was very careful. She said no physical harm done. I know lots of people not lots of people's names who've been mentioned in the WikiLeaks, in the State Department cables. Whilst certainly no physical harm has come of it, it certainly does make you think about which diplomats you speak to and about how you have to be some circumspect.
John Altenberg, I mean, what do you think about that? The statement there by Naomi that no physical harm was done there.
I think that's accurate. As far as I know, it is accurate to say that no physical harm has been proven. But that's not Manning's fault. I mean, there's a certain amount of luck involved in that, and it very well could have caused harm because we know it got to people that would like to do harm to U.S. soldiers and U.S. civilians, actually. And so why it didn't happen may be due to their ineptitude, their inability to act on it quickly enough, a lack of financing and resources to do something with the information that they had. But the fact is that Manning released information that could easily have been used to harm American soldiers and civilians and Afghans. And perhaps more to the point, this is somebody who was trained in intelligence and who had been warned, in his training to be careful and why to be careful, and had some knowledge as to how the enemy, Al Qaeda and others, use the internet to gather information and to develop, actions against people in the Western world. And so he had more knowledge even than a regular soldier, an infantryman who didn't have the specific training about intelligence and why it was sensitive, and why he was supposed to be careful, and how the enemy might use the information that he might release. And I think that Jag's right too to point out that 700,000. There's no way that young Manning was able to read all that or to really understand the potential consequences of what he was releasing to the enemy. And in that sense, I'd maintain that it really was reckless.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. Whistleblowers, are they heroes or villains? Joining me to discuss this is Naomi Colvin, Jag Singh, and Major General John Altenberg. Naomi Colvin, I suppose the way that his supporters would view it is that he contributed to the Arab Spring. You mentioned the Tunisia case there. Perhaps, I mean, what do you think that his supporters are feeling now, that any kind of punishment, if there is punishment meted out to him, was justified if the wake of the Arab Spring has completely transformed the Middle East?
It has, and there's certainly a pattern of causation between the Arab Spring and this amazing spread of sort of grassroots democracy movements that happened throughout 2011. Bradley Manning's disclosures also contributed to the withdrawal of US troops from Iraq. I think it's important to recognise as well. So his impact is enormous. In terms of the punishment he will probably receive at the end of this court-martial, again, we should recognise that Bradley was punished quite significantly before there were any court hearings. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture conducted an investigation and decided that he'd been subjected to cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment at the Quantico Brig in Virginia. In terms of what will happen at the court-martial, this is the enactment of something which has been planned for a long time. I don't think there's any doubt that the sentence Bradley will receive at the end of it is substantial. What will make a difference to Bradley's case, I believe, is grassroots pressure, civil society pressure, international pressure on the US. I can't give you a time frame on that, how that will change things, but I believe it will eventually.
Jackson, do you think that will make a difference? International pressure, I mean, presumably that would fly in the face of an independent judiciary, though, in the United States.
Well, bear in mind that this is currently a military tribunal, and so there's no jury. It's all in front of a judge, one single solitary sort of individual. I don't think international pressure is going to really work. I think that pressure would have to come from within the U.S. and there would have to be political pressure applied. I just don't see international pressure having any sort of bearing on the U.S. military sort of internal legal process, and I'm sure the general will be able to sort of attest to that.
John Altenberg, I mean, what about people in America? How are they divided in opinion on their views of Bradley Manning? It seems to be pretty much 50-50, doesn't it?
It seems to be. I mean, and my only knowledge of any of that is what I read in the paper or see on the newscasts. And Jag's correct that there are 4 military tribunals under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The tribunal that Manning is facing is your standard issue, what we'd say in the military, court-martial. It's just a regular court-martial. And it's true also, as Jag said, that he's before a judge and there's no jury, but that was his choice because he could have had a panel of officers or he could have had a panel of members, the equivalent of a civilian jury. He could have had a panel that had 1/3 enlisted, and in consultation with his defense lawyer, he chose to have a judge alone, which, by the way, is very unusual in U.S. military courts for someone to go forward with a trial and go judge alone rather than to have a jury. I don't want to speculate as to why he and his defense lawyer decided to do that, but that was his choice to go that way. And as to anything that happens with regard to a sentence, I think it's correct to say that the pressure will have to come within the U.S. I think there won't be too much concern for international pressure as much as and there will be some pressure within the U.S. I think.
Naomi Colvin, you're part of that international pressure, aren't you?
Sure. To those who question the impact of international pressure, I would say it's certainly the case that international pressure was critical in getting Bradley moved out of solitary confinement in Quantico. In April 2011, there's no question that played a part. I'm not saying this is going to happen immediately. I think it's going to take a long time. And I think we need to get bodies like Amnesty to stand up for amnesty. But, the Council of Europe has already accepted a report which describes Bradley Manning as a whistleblower. Dozens of members of the European Parliament signed a joint letter, I think just over a year ago, describing Bradley as a whistleblower and writing to the US government officially. So that support is there at an official level. And I think from my point of view and from supporters' point of view, it's going to be important to keep the pressure on. And I'm not saying it's going to happen quickly. It's going to be, we're talking years here.
And indeed, earlier on, you referred to that Edward Snowden, going back to our initial part of the discussion, and Bradley Manning are relatively close in age. They're of a certain generation. Do you think that we could see more whistleblowers in future being inspired by their actions?
Well, for me, one of the factors about Edward Snowden that makes me most optimistic is that despite the hugely disproportionate and unlawful treatment Bradley Manning was subjected to, which I think in part must surely be to chill and warn any future potential whistleblowers and make them aware of the potential ramifications of their actions. That even despite all that, Edward Snowden still felt that it was appropriate to act. I hope that others follow his example. It's incredibly admirable.
Jag Singh, what's your view? Edward Snowden, hero or villain? Bradley Manning, hero or villain?
On this note, I'd actually agree with Naomi and both generally. We won't be able to tell if they're heroes or villains. It's far too early. Our judgments are clouded. But I'm leaning towards Bradley Manning, villain, Edward Snowden, hero.
John Altenberg, can I get your reaction?
I'm not going to characterize them one way or the other. Because I guess I'm the one that said it first. That I don't think we can tell until many years go by, and we see it in the wake of everything else. We don't know what we don't know. My concern is that neither of them knows what he doesn't know, and they're both very young, and they've imposed their judgment on their governments, and so they're just going to have to suffer the consequences of that. I'd characterize them each as a defendant. And let it go at that. And I might also pick up on the unlawful treatment of Manning, because that's accurate, and he already has received credit for all the time that he spent in pretrial will come off any sentence that he has that is ultimately handed down. And also, the judge has made a finding as to the unlawful treatment and inappropriate treatment of Manning by the corrections people when he was at Quantico. And she's made a judgment in that regard and added some time to account for the treatment that he received.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. We'll have to leave it there, but I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests. That's on the line from Washington, D.C., Major General John Altenberg, a former lawyer for the U.S. Army, and joining me here in the studio, Jag Singh, political and digital strategist, and Naomi Colvin, founder of UK Friends of Bradley Manning. Thank you for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.